Welcome, everyone, to What the Force. I'm Marie-Claire Gould, your host, and joining me for this episode is Missy.
Hello, all.
And our special guest for this topic and also his own perspective, Ryan Looney, who is a published feature writer on Collider and a friend of the show. Welcome, Ryan.
Hello. It's my first podcast, so I'm a little nervous, but I think we're going to have a great time. We've already had a great conversation, so I think we'll do just fine.
We'll take good care of you, I promise.
I'm sure you will.
So this topic is super interesting. It is on blindness as a disability in Star Wars with a lens to myth and folklore. And we wanted to bring Ryan on specifically because of your own perspective. So Ryan, could you talk a little bit about yourself and your own story?
Sure. If you want to know how perfect things are, I was literally born on the very day Phantom Menace came out, May 19th, 1999. Premature, 4 months early, 1 in 6 chance to live. So you can unironically say the Force saved my life. I say that half jokingly half the time, and half the time I mean it. I'm also an autistic adult. I'm admittedly much younger than these two. I'm only 25, but I've been watching Star Wars my whole life. Much of my early years of my childhood, I was a fan of the Legends works. I don't exactly see eye to eye with a lot of other fans I know on certain things, but I'm someone who, as you can imagine, strived for better representation, because disability especially is very lacking in film and television, and some of the narratives surrounding it can be problematic, even when they're used correctly with the accurate people. So it's nice to talk about it in a realm of a series that feels like home.
Oh, that's nice. And, your own lens of this. Blindness, sorry.
It's fine. Make all the puns you want. It doesn't bother me. I'm used to it.
Visual impairment, it's important, right, to talk about because of the way that it's portrayed or sometimes not portrayed.
Yeah, and I'm not, at least for myself, I'm not someone who has placed a lot of emphasis on specific terms, which is ironic because I'm usually someone who's gets very hung up on technicalities. I'd be like, no, this word has a specific legal or corporate definition. Use it this way. Don't use it anywhere. Don't use it like this in your lingo. But at least personally, because it's something I lived with my whole life, I'm a lot more casual about it. I'm also in a bit of a weird position, I should add, for anyone who is wondering. I am visually impaired, and I do have a blind white cane. I need to get a new one because it's busted after 10 years. But
oh no.
I'm completely blind in my left eye, and I'm legally blind in my right, so I have limited vision. I don't remember the exact ratio, but it puts me in a bit of an awkward middle ground. Mm-hmm. So I'm not for example, I never learned Braille, right? Because I never had to, because I can see with enough context and, with the right texture and font and background, I can read and write. But I also, for example, but it still affects me, right? For example, I cannot read for long stretches of time. So I'm an actor in training, and whenever I have to use scripts, I always either have to transcribe them on a format that works for me, or I have to use a text-to-speech app or use verbal communication, right? So it's different for everybody. And I don't know, it'll be different for everybody's journey, and mine's definitely unique, I'd say.
Yeah. And this is really important because, one of the things that we're going to be talking about is the difference between the lived reality and the way that it's portrayed. And one of the things that you tend to get a lot in film and television and just story in general is this treatment of it as very binary, as sight or no sight. And of course, the reality is it's a spectrum. And so that's very different from the way that it tends to be portrayed.
And even if I may reference a totally different series, recently one of the shows that just came out, which I briefly covered recently on Collider, was All Light We Cannot See, which is the first blind actress in a leading role. Yes. She's Mila Birdie. She's amazing. She's has the same degree as me. She's only 5 years older than me, so I relate to her a lot already. But her character, she is, for example, she is legally blind, and she has a condition that makes her sensitive to light, makes her colorblind, but she is not totally blind. She'd mentioned for the role, she had to actually kind of repractice her Braille a little bit because she hadn't done Braille in so long. She has a cane, she has a guide dog, but the character is totally without sight. So And to be fair, like that's a good example of a show that does it well because it does not linger on her condition. It treats it pretty well, and it does not make her helpless in the least. In fact, she, for example, lands the killing blow on the villain. That was great to see. And recently, regardless of my problems with it from a story perspective and things like that, like it's a really authentic and wonderful portrayal. So we're just now seeing things start to coalesce a little bit. So no better time than now, I suppose.
And I think that we need to talk about stories like this, like Echo, as far as like disability rep, other stories that are actually bringing these experiences to the forefront from a fictional perspective and saying, look, it's not a limitation. It's just part of who this human happens to be.
Yeah. And we're seeing that with other areas too. I mean, Coda just won Best Picture 2 years ago, and it was amazing, and it's beautiful. And too bad it got overshadowed by the whole Will Slip slapping incident. But grievances aside, we've got Everything Is Going to Be Okay, which is a minor TV show for one of the first autistic actresses. I believe American Horror Story had a actor with Down syndrome. And yeah, we're slowly making progress and it's slowly getting better, but we got some long ways to go. And there are still some problematic narrative themes that need to be deconstructed a little bit.
And I think that this is a good point to start talking about how viewing visual impairment or disability or alternative ability as a metaphor can actually have a lot of problems with it. And we see some of those pop up in Star Wars. And so I think it's important to just bring that to the forefront, have this conversation. Yeah. Missy, you have some kind of sources you wanted to talk about first, and then we can kind of get perspectives from everyone in this little round table.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So in preparation for this conversation, I read a couple of books. There's actually a fairly large number of sources on this topic. So if you're interested in it, I really do recommend diving in. A lot of good stuff. So one of the ones I read was called Disability, Deformity, and Disease in the Grimm's Fairy Tales by Anne Schmiesing. She's considered a bit of an expert in this area. I did notice that this book is available on ebooks and Kindle. It unfortunately doesn't have an audiobook, but hopefully Kindle version works for a lot of people. And then the other one is Disfigured on Fairy Tales, Disability, and Making Space by Amanda Leduc. That one does have an audiobook. Great news there. And these are really excellent sources that dive into this problem with the way that using disability as a metaphor actually can objectify disabled bodies. So I'm going to have a brief quote from Anne Schmiesing. It is, reading disability merely as a metaphor for something else is in itself a form of erasure because it abstracts the individual and his or her disabled body. So this is really important because the way that Star Wars portrays it definitely leans into that quite a lot. There's a lot of conversation about the light and the dark and being blind to something and unable to see something. And, that can be a problem sometimes. Then there's also another thing that Star Wars does very, very heavily is lean into this compensation theory of disability, which based on the idea that if one of your senses is not as strong, that the others become stronger. This leads to this sort of superhero idea of the blind superhero. So you think of like Daredevil, right? And in Star Wars, exactly. We have, right, exactly. In Star Wars, we have Kanan and Chirrut. And the problem with this portrayal, among other things, is that it actually can lead to an idea in real life that a person with a disability, because they have these now super abilities in other areas, don't need accessibility accommodations. And then the accessibility is not provided for those people. And that's obviously a huge problem in a world where we don't have enough accessibility as it is. So, yeah.
That's one thing. Well, I enjoy Rebels quite decently, and I actually really appreciate what they did with Kanan in the third season, with him coming to terms with that. I do wish, for example, they had leaned a bit more into that. Like, I do like, for example, when he first loses his sight and takes the lightsaber blade to the face, he uses his new senses to survive, like, just in the short term, survive that duel with Maul. And, like, that worked. Like I have no problem with that because this new area has now opened up to him, and Maul is of course famously overconfident in every fight he does. So that I had no problem with that, and I did appreciate what they did with him. But I do wish we had shown another example, even just a very like one line scene, like if they're talking with him and Ezra, and I don't know, let's say Hera, and he could turn to Ezra at one point and say, like, what is she thinking? What look is she giving me? Even small things like that would have done a lot, I
Yeah,
think,
yeah, because he couldn't actually
Right.
see
Yeah.
her face. And even in the Force, maybe he could sense her,
Yeah.
but that still is not the same as being able to see her reaction.
Like the Force can help you like survive, dodge a bullet and dodge a lightsaber, but you still can't like socially read a room, with
Mhm.
that. So
Yeah.
it'd be great if you could.
Yeah, like how yeah. Like what is the face that Hera is making would have made such a big difference. I definitely see
Yeah,
that, right?
And it
For
would have been
sure.
funny. And it would have also been funny because that also just like totally plays into their dynamic of
Yes.
Hera is like mildly annoyed with Kanan half the time. like, you know, this is your friend? Wait a
Yeah.
minute, man. Oh yeah, I can see why. I'm pissed at you too. Like it works. So
And this sort of makes me question whether they actually ever talked with somebody who was blind when they were
Yeah.
I
writing
feel like
these
we
scripts.
didn't, and I don't want to put words in people's mouths or make assumptions, but I actually feel like because the series is animated, I have a feeling, for instance, and no disrespect to Freddie Prinze Jr., he does a wonderful job at
Mhm.
portraying Kanan. It's sad to see that he's moved on, but I was still hoping we get a flashback scene with him at some point in live action. But
Mhm.
Yeah.
but I have a strong feeling that he did not either ask or, maybe even think to ask to consult, because it's a voiceover performance, right? You wouldn't think
Mhm.
that you would have to accommodate for something like that. And whereas if Rebels had been a live action show, or if, say, Kanan had lived long enough to appear in Ahsoka,
Mhm.
still blind, like I think I have no doubt in that case they would have absolutely gone out of their way to hire a consultant and something like that. But because it's
Mhm.
animated, I feel like they didn't feel the need to.
Mhm.
Which again, in one sense, I can understand because it's such a different medium, but it still creates problems, and
Mhm.
it's still it's still it doesn't explore as much as they could or probably should have, I think.
Mhm.
Yeah, and it doesn't give a true reflection of the reality of the experience, regardless of the fact that
Yeah.
they're all space wizards.
Yeah.
And there's magic.
Yep.
Yeah, and you know what I was also a little disappointed by was, like, I didn't mind, for example, in the amazing scene where Kanan finally meets his end, probably one of the best scenes in the whole show, where that final shot where he does regain his sight for like one
Right.
last Hera again. Like I
Mhm.
had no problem with that. That I thought was actually pretty beautiful. But I wish we had even just very briefly gotten like a POV shot, right? To see, because they never even emphasize how much of his sight is gone. I mean, I assume
Mhm.
all of it.
Right, like where he couldn't see and then appears to
Right.
see,
Yeah.
like
Does he still have a bit of peripheral vision? Does
Yeah.
he have to see entirely through the Force? Like,
Mhm.
does he have to, in the words of Kreia, view the universe through a keyhole?
Mhm.
Right. So
Yeah.
again, I still thought it was decently well handled, and I think they handled his coping with it very well. But there's a couple small things I wish they could have done better.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting too, the way that, they will kind of go back and forth between when a character needs some kind of accommodation and they don't. Like there are scenes where you can actually see him putting his hand on Ezra's shoulder and Ezra
Yeah.
leading him. And then
Yeah.
other scenes where he has no problem running through wherever, and so
I know, and
it's
it's like,
very all over the map. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and to me that comes down to the
Mhm.
writing, because with animation especially, everything is driven from the
Right.
script.
Yeah.
And the pipeline is created from there. They go off and they have to animate so much in the different stages of their animation.
Yeah, and there's
And then the voiceover comes so much
Mhm.
later.
Wow.
So if it's
Yeah.
not in the earliest stages, and that to me speaks to having people who have lived and experienced consulted or in the
Mhm.
writing
Yeah.
room.
And it's also I feel like because it's animated, like it's one of those things, like if they had been on a live action set, like if they had shot this wherever, I don't know where they shot Ahsoka, but if they had sought this in the same way, like I feel like just literally being on the ground, that question would have come up more. Like even if there wasn't a consultant, I feel like if Freddie Prinze Jr. had been there in live action to do it, I feel like he would have had a lot more questions about, what is his gait,
What is this
what is
like?
his gait like, what is his balance like, what his physical mannerisms and stuff like that. Whereas it's animated, you don't have to deal with that because it's entirely done in animation. And translating, I don't want to say that translating a script animation is easier than live action because that's not the right word, but it's more streamlined, right? It's whereas actual on set, that would have been more of a trial and error kind of thing,
right?
Where they could have really experimented with that. So part of it's just the medium, and I totally get it, but I wish they had put a bit more thought into it, I suppose.
Yeah,
absolutely. Missy, do you have any other thoughts?
I think this was kind of the main thing I wanted to share, is just make sure that we understood, that historically this stuff does appear in myth and folklore, and then they're also doing it in Star Wars, and we think it can be better. And so I think it's important to understand that while we are going to be discussing how Star Wars has used blindness in its storytelling thus far, we really strongly believe that Star Wars can and should do better to be more humanizing and more inclusive in their portrayal of disability.
Absolutely. And I don't think that their use of this motif will actually reduce. I think that they will use it more in the future. I don't think it's something that they're going to stop using because it is fundamental to how George used and talked about the dark side, especially. It's fundamental to how he views tapping into certain aspects of the Force. And I think that Dave has learned a lot from that and will probably be something that is used more in the future.
I agree. Like I have many criticisms of Dave Filoni, but one thing I will say is that when you hear him talk about his ideas and concepts, he really is George's apprentice. He really did learn everything from George, and you can see that reflected through him. And I think that I do think it's hope. I do hope it's something they explore more. I mean, in canon, we see a couple of examples, but we don't have many. We have Kanan, we have Chirrut, who I believe was not written as blind. I believe it was Donnie Yen himself who suggested the idea. And of course, Legends, probably Treya is the biggest example. You can put Jarek in there, arguably, but that's almost a non-example. But so the examples are still sparse, but they're doing a better job with it than, I will give them credit, a better job than many other franchises are doing, because it's something they're at least exploring and trying to dig into.
Yeah, absolutely. So we wanted to dig into how the motif is used inside of Star Wars, as well as in folklore and mythology. One of the top ones that is used often in folklore, fairy tale, and mythology is used as a punishment. So you have done something wrong against the universe, or just in general, and you are blinded because of this. This is not unlike what happens to Kanan, although it's arguable about what he did wrong other than just say yes to Ezra's
it's funny.
plans.
I heard that and I was like, well, what did Kanan do wrong? Like, he didn't do anything wrong.
No, he just said yes to Ezra wanting to go to Malachor.
I know.
Right?
Like, is that what you're being punished for? Like, if he had been like overconfident in a duel, like that would have been understandable, I guess. But like, what did he even do wrong? Why is the Force so mean to me? He was probably asking that question on the trip home.
Missy, do you have thoughts on this one?
Yeah, it definitely shows up as punishment. This kind of overlaps with some other ways that the motif is used. Notably, it is sometimes actually used as a metaphor for death. And obviously that's massively problematic. For obvious reasons. Yeah, for obvious reasons. But like, I think it's important to understand that this is, it's this punishment can put you into this state of mythic or psychic death. And then typically what you will have is that they will emerge from that eventually. So of course, the example you already gave of Kanan momentarily regaining his sight and able to see Hera before he dies. And so you will see that a lot. One of the examples that I'm looking forward to digging into is Han Solo Apollo's temporary blindness, because that is also him. Right. He emerges from a death state and then, gradually comes to see again. And you actually see this as a huge turning point for his character as well.
By the way, fun fact, if you didn't know, I can't read comics very well, so I haven't explored it, but I do know there was a non-canon, it was non-canon even during the Legends era. There was they did a lot of what if stories, and there was one for Return of the Jedi, and if I recall correctly, one of the things that happens is that Han Solo becomes permanently blind. You see him with the bandage for the whole story, and he's still having to pilot the Millennium Falcon. It's not, being a comic, being the nature of the medium, it's not something they could have dove into really very deeply, but it was kind of just for fun. It wasn't meant to be a serious story. It was just kind of was basically the comics, basically kind of like the Marvel What If comics, not really meant to be taken seriously. But I remember seeing that and just thinking, oh, like this would have been an interesting turn for him.
Yeah, that would be really interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's funny also because I'm also just imagining if George had done that, like made him totally blind, that would have also been, I don't want to say darkly humorous, because I feel like that would have pissed off Harrison Ford, because he famously, of course, won Han to Die in episode 6, and he'd be like, "Why? I was so close. Will you do this to me instead?" Like, it would be, Harrison Ford would see that as
George
a punishment.
be like, "But it's a metaphorical death," and he'd be like,
death. Exactly, right? So,
the other way we often see this in folklore and myth and fairy tale, as well as in Star Wars, is the blind seer archetype, which is that because you are blind, you are more powerful in some way. We get this in Daredevil, obviously.
If you forgive me for referencing Daredevil for a second, I will note that Daredevil, although, of course, Charlie Cox, I believe his actor's name, that's right, he, of course, is not visually impaired himself. But from what little I saw of it at the time, I never got a chance to watch it thoroughly. But I remember that there were a couple scenes in Daredevil where he's in like a meeting with this other lawyer at the law firm. And he's like, "Dude, I'm blind. Can you put the damn thing on the screen? Like, tell me what's on the damn screen."
Yeah. Can you give me the Braille version?
Yeah, Braille version.
That a lot. And Charlie actually talked about learning Braille and a few other things that he specifically consulted with to understand more about how to behave in that way.
And I understand. I've heard people make the argument with him when I made the argument that we should have gotten the blind Daredevil. Of course, now we won't, because they're continuing the old one of new stories. But by the way, adding on to that, adding into what you said, the new story is literally called Born Again. So, but which I know is a famous comic where he loses everything and has to reemerge. But adding into that, I've heard people make the argument, for example, that we can't have, including from really knowledgeable people who I really like, have argued that it would be really hard to have a blind actor play Daredevil because of the fight scenes and because that would be difficult to choreograph. And I'm like, that's what you think stunt doubles for. Like, I understand there might be some situations that they might have difficulty portraying and might have some difficulties with, but for most of those scenes, it's not that difficult. So I can understand in this, and I do appreciate the fact
he wears a mask.
He does. He also wears a mask, right? So it's not like it's going to be, too difficult to swap out for a double. But for something like that, I'm a bit more accepting of it because Charlie Cox has been very considerate and everything, and he's done a lot of work with that. But it's still just a clear example of, blind actors for blind roles. We just got, although I didn't watch the show, I know we just got, what's the character's name? Is it Echo? Who's played by a real deaf Native American actress. Like, she was pretty cool. But with Daredevil especially is probably the most egregious example of superpower blindness, quite literally. It's something that in whatever incarnation comes next, I hope they work on.
Yeah.
And give to someone who has that experience.
A little bit just more into the blind seer archetype. The most famous example is from Oedipus Rex in mythology with Tiresias, who is, of course, the blind seer prophet of Apollo that curses Oedipus with the idea, because Oedipus says, "You're blind. What do you know?" And he says, "Well, you will be soon." And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where Oedipus, due to his own shame of betting his own mother, plucks out his own eyes. Again, punishment.
Yeah. But it also takes us directly into that next way that the motif is used.
Yeah, which is psychic dismemberment. Missy, did you want to talk a little bit about this?
So similar to what Oedipus does, like he's so mortified by what he's done that he gouges out his own eyes. We actually also see this in a lot of Snow White variations. And if you haven't heard that before, it's probably because it's really gross and gory. And so it's not shared frequently with children.
I remember having to read a lot of the in high school. I remember having to read a lot of the old Grimm's fairy tales, the original versions, and I had to present that in front of a classroom. And I remember just because in our mythology class, and I remember how painfully awkward it was. For example, having to explain that Rumpelstiltskin raped a woman and got stuck.
I know, there's all kinds of things like that.
It's like, should I dance around this? Should I adjust it directly, or what?
No, there's a lot of really horrifying things, and that's and there's reasons why this stuff appears in mythology and everything and in fairy tales, but there are Snow Whites that have to gouge out their eyes. A lot of times their sight is restored later, but there's also then, to kind of go back to the punishment example, there's a grim version of Cinderella where
I was just about to add that.
Birds pluck out the stepsister's eyes afterwards and things like that.
Don't they also cut off their toes and their heels to fit into the slippers or something?
Yes, exactly. Well, that's kind of the thing is that it's not just blindness, right? It's also dismemberment, which is very common. Of course, that's obviously very common in Star Wars as well. Everybody's always losing hands in Star Wars. So
it's a tradition now. Even Marvel has explicitly adopted it. I know. Everyone loses a hand in the movie.
I know, exactly.
He said it's explicitly in Star Wars.
It is.
We were wondering about Rey. We were like,
she's gonna lose a hand. I know, right?
Well, have you? I don't know if either of you have read the course now lost Duels of the Fate script, but it did have Rey lose her eyes.
Really? That's so interesting.
It had if you didn't know, the final fight between Kylo Ren and Rey was on Mortis. Actually on Mortis. You saw the son, the daughter, and everything, and the father. And there is during the fight, it shows him. It's interesting, of course, because they took that story obviously in a very different direction, partially because Carrie Fisher had died a week after it was finished. But one of the big things in that script is that Kylo Ren really does come into his own as a Sith Lord, and he's clearly proven to be raised better. And he slashes her across the eyes in the exact same way that Maul did to Kanan. And which would have certainly made the new Rey movie interesting if they had gone that route, but they didn't. So it's something that they still, even though that
play with,
they still have in mind, and they still want to play with.
And what this typically means, though, when they have it as, framed as psychic dismemberment. So to your point, like the slashing or the gouging or whatever it may be, this is the idea that some aspect of separation from self, that there is, something about yourself that you're disassociating with, either forcibly or just, again, because of shame in the case of Oedipus. And there's a lot of examples, but, this separation from self. And that's also the reason why the healing is so frequently accompanies this, is because if you have become separated from yourself, then ultimately the goal is to then become whole again. Now, again, to go back to the problems with this representation is that, it suggests then that something is defective and something is wrong, and that the person cannot be whole without then losing their disability. And that's a problem, but that's how it's typically used in mythology.
And going back to, although it's not a specific blind example, Anakin, one thing that is really interesting is you think about how most of the Sith Lords portrayed throughout history, whether it's Vader, or Dooku or Bane, especially Bane, a lot of them literally practice disassociation as part of their livelihoods, right? It's in fact, I'd argue the only one who doesn't really do that, for those who have read the novel, is Plagueis, because Plagueis, in many ways, his public persona and his Sith persona are literally two sides of the same coin. In fact, I'd argue that some of the best moments in that book are his public ventures. Like he does not wear the dark side like a mask that he takes off when he comes home. He's literally the same person, just expressed through political means or supernatural means, and that's fascinating and interesting. And of course, he also gets disfigured when he loses half of his face. But going to perhaps the ultimate example of disability as punishment, tying back into Christian themes of, a Faustian bargain, is the transformation machine, where Anakin wakes up in the suit for the first time, citing to quote the amazing, iconic internal monologue from the novelization of Revenge of the Sith. He has that amazing line. Matthew Stover wrote that amazing line where he said, you were like a painter gone blind, a painter gone blind, a composer gone deaf. You can remember where the power was, but the power you can touch is only a memory. Like, and they, even says like, when you open your eyes, you look at your scorched eyes, and you see the world through this simulacrum. And like, I like the notion he even adds, or perhaps, hideous. He says something like, the eyes simulate light and everything through a hideous simulacrum. Or maybe the simulacrum is just fine. It's perfect, and it's the world that's hideous when you get down to it. Like,
right,
it is so profound.
And we see him healed in a way in Return of the Jedi, because he has to take off the mask. Yeah. That's the only way he wants to see his son, is with his own eyes and not through the machine.
Still the most, probably, that scene, and of course the immediate scene preceding that with killing the Emperor, is still probably my favorite all-time scene in cinema.
Oh, and I'm with you.
Every time I see it,
we're all on the same page.
Every time I see it, I also the special distance version where he says, "No, get that out of here." The silence with which he does it is amazing. Every time I see it, I cheer.
Yeah,
beautiful.
I've been meaning to talk about the apotheosis that Vader and Luke go through in that moment for a really long time, and I just haven't, because it's like, it's my childhood wrapped up, like all of my childhood memories wrapped up into a single moment in that, and like why I care about Star Wars so much.
Yep, same.
I remember watching that scene as a kid and having, of course, on DVD, and just rewatching that scene over and over and over. Something about it is just so special.
It is. It's so good. It is the most. I know we're getting off topic, but like, it's the most healing scene in Star Wars. I really think it is. I really think it is.
And knowing the prequels makes it, reinforces it, right? It reinforces the themes about how the Jedi Code is wrong, and of course, like, that's a whole other discussion. But having watched the prequels first and then watch the originals, it makes it so much more meaningful.
Yeah. Great stuff.
We also see this motif as a recognition motif, where you cannot recognize the world around you. Yeah. We see this a lot in the Jedi being blinded to the dark side and what they're doing. It is also connected sometimes in story to memory loss. It's a very similar motif to memory loss.
Which is a very common theme. Right? I mean, we've seen that the Acolyte was going down that route a bit with May towards the end. Of course, now we'll never get to see it. But of course, the biggest and most famous example is Revan, right? And of course, now part of that is also done because of the structure of the game, because it's a very self-insert kind of game. That's for when the twist happens.
Yeah, and you need to start from a blank slate kind of idea and build it. Yeah. And
that's why the twist happens and why it's so effective. And of course, I've made the argument, people have had debates about remaking that into a movie all the time. And I've always argued that because of the way the game is structured,
it's hard.
You can't do it that way. You'd have to find another way to do it, whether it's with a memory, whether it involves a memory wipe or not. And of course, there's also material before that. There are some the Old Republic comics, which are amazing, explore a bit of his time in the Mandalorian Wars. But, and I should add this, they also, that character also is someone who ends up blind. And Lucien Dray, who is the perfect example is one of the few examples of a living redemption story in the old Star Wars continuity. He commits a horrible massacre of his own Padawans, and only one Padawan escapes alive. It's actually very similar to the Wrong Jedi, the original final arc that Ahsoka goes through in the Clone Wars. It's an extremism event to event a prophecy from being fulfilled. And of course, at the end, Lucien Dre realizes what he's doing wrong, realizes he's about to go past the point of no return, so he basically launches an artillery strike from orbit on the main villain and on himself. And the twist is that he lives, and that you later see him as a blind mystic alone on a planet. I think it was like a private property. Like no one knows he's alive, and he says, for the first time now I can see, and now I see my future, and now I know, I know that I cannot prevent the darkness that's coming, but I can survive it, and I can get a group together that can survive it. And it's a really great story. I mean,
yeah, that's cool.
That's so interesting because it actually represents a crone transformation.
It does. Massive credit to
You're like
John
where they're
Jackson
turning into
crone to mage.
Crone
that's really cool.
Yeah, crone to mage.
That's very cool.
It's definitely a different ending for him than I had expected. Massive credit to John Jackson Miller. He's
neat.
One of the most underrated authors, I think, of the old stories.
Nice.
We also see it as tricking visually impaired people.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about this?
So this is another one where it's like it's kind of problematic, but it's actually really common. I don't know if people realize how common it is. So one example that a lot of people might be familiar with in mythology is in the Bible, the stolen blessing in the Jacob and Esau story, where the father has the really bad eyesight, and so they try to trick him and steal the son's blessing by wearing the furred cloak, because one of the sons is very hairy. And so that's one thing that's used often. Another example you might know is from Hansel and Gretel. The witch is trying to fatten up Hansel, and so she tells him to stick his finger through the bars because she can't see him, and she wants to feel, whether he's fattening up, and he puts a bone through the bars of his cage, so that she thinks that he's not fattening up. And so in these cases, there are characters who are the heroes that are tricking another character who is visually impaired. And so in Star Wars, you see the example of in the Clone Wars when they're trying to escape from the Geonosian Queen. She spends all her life underground, and it's very dark, and she does not have strong eyesight. And so the clones actually shine a very bright light in her eyes. It temporarily blinds her, and it allows them to escape. So this is used very often as well. It's not as much symbol.
Using a more combative example, the way that Ventress escapes her first betrayal by Dooku is by blinding him.
Right. Yeah, I forgot about that. No, you're totally right. Yeah, exactly. So that's another great example.
Shunting his lightsaber into the side to hit like one of the pipes was burst in his face.
Right. Well, and just the example of any time that you see a character like grab a handful of sand and throw it in the other character's eyes to give them the upper hand briefly, like that's another very common situation.
Which, to be fair, is a classic maneuver that I believe samurai would use. So
right, exactly.
It fits the culture and everything, and a lot of the combat is inspired by a mix of the lightsaber combat is inspired by a mix of sometimes European martial arts, but also fencing, but also a bit of Japanese as well. So, of course, no surprise there. Kurosawa was a big influence.
Right, exactly. And there's a couple different ways you can view that. Sometimes it's used to say that someone is sort of underhanded and that they're they're not playing fair or whatever.
That's what it usually means.
But then on the flip side, sometimes you'll also see it as with a character that is more in touch with their intuition and therefore more connected to the earth. And so by using sand or, dirt or whatever, they're actually showing that connection to the earth. So sometimes you'll also see that used where it's like, they're able to use their instincts to win.
That's funny that you bring that up because whenever I watch a lot of fight scenes, comparing, say, again, going back to Revenge of the Sith, one of the reasons why the fight between Dooku and Anakin and Obi-Wan in the first act is so great is because their fighting styles are complete reflections of their characters. And you see that in Duel of the Fates is also another one, I would argue. The Acolyte with Knight, I think, had that a little bit as well. And it's not often that we get a fight scene that really tries to essentially reflect the character through their fighting style. But once in a while, we will get one of those. And when they do make one of those, it makes it so much richer.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Usually it focuses just on rule of cool, which is totally understandable because most of the character buildup is supposed to be done before the fight, not during it. But if you can add on to that and have them fight in the way that, that reflects them, there's a reason why like Qui-Gon is so headstrong because he's such a maverick and I'll go where the Force takes me and it gets him killed. Things like that work amazingly well.
It's because lightsaber fights represent the conflict of the soul.
Yeah.
And so when you have the characters represented more strongly in those lightsaber battles, especially like Duel of the Fates.
Yeah. Whereas ones that don't feel that way, ones like the first fight on Geonosis between Dooku and Anakin and Obi-Wan. It's, again, part of it's the choreography, but, you don't get a sense. Yeah, you get a sense of Anakin's inexperience and stuff like that. And Obi-Wan's totally outclassed, but with the exception of Dooku, I would argue, I'd say Dooku in that fight reflects his fighting style pretty well because he's a bit of a snake in that way, and I'd attribute that. I'm sure part of that probably Christopher Lee had something to do with it because he was very consultative and had a lot of experience. There's that famous story in Lord of the Rings about how he said, "This is how you stab somebody in the back when you're going to kill me," right? So things like that, with Saruman. So things like that, I imagine he might have. I would not be surprised if he consulted on, how am I going to choreograph it? So when it doesn't happen, it's not bad. It's just it makes it feel lesser, I think.
Yep.
Even the fights in the original trilogy, as a bit archaic as they are. To use an example, the first fight between Obi-Wan and Vader on the Death Star, right? It's interesting because, of course, a couple years ago, somebody went and famously recreated that whole fight scene, and it was amazingly well made. But it's interesting that, like, with that fight, it's very interesting how, it was shot in 1976, really 1977, but how that fight, all later sources would actually kind of explain why that fight kind of looks like crap, and they would offer the explanation of the fact they're fighting very linearly because Obi-Wan is not. Yes, he's practiced in a lot over years. He does exercises, but he has not had a sparring partner. Whereas Vader is extremely cautious after all these years, and how Obi-Wan makes some headway initially, and Vader has to rely on a kind of neither attacking nor offensive nor defensive role to kind of push and pull him around, and of course Obi-Wan gets tired. His mounting fatigue makes that fight unwinnable. So it's really weird, especially with being an old EU fan. Like, there are some things that will be addressed on occasion in supplicant sources that'll be like, this wasn't handled well, or this wasn't, or feels a little bit off. Let's have an entire chapter of a book explain why it looks like this, and it's great. And of course, there's also, you go back to there's also just the dynamic of being a live action, right? You go back to the original Clone Wars miniseries that Gennady Tartakovsky made. I can't pronounce his name. You watch those fight scenes, and those are like something straight out of anime, right? And they're amazing, and they really give you a sense of the scale of, Mace Windu wiping out an entire army, or General Grievous taking out an entire army on the battlefield. Massive. I will always say, classic Grievous forever. That will always be Grievous to me. But and yeah, part of it's a medium change, part of it's just a continuity thing, part of it's a fan service thing. But if you can reflect the characters to the fights you're doing, I think it can be make things more impactful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know we got off track a bit there with that, but
That's fine.
Okay.
I've always been so fascinated by how much detail they give to those fights. That you can actually like research and practice and do all those forms of combat. They're real stunts you can do.
Exactly. So just moving on a little bit to why, right? So why is blindness typically used as a metaphor in Star Wars? So psychologically, when we talk about story and facing the shadow aspects of ourselves, we can't see the shadow directly. We are blind to our own shadow. And so we have to go into ourselves to be able to actually confront our own shadow. We have to do a lot of shadow work, which means we have to cut off our access to our own vision of this outer world, thus be blinded to be able to see the story that is being told inside of ourselves. Marie-Louise von Franz, who I often talk about on this podcast, in Archetypical Symbols and Fairy Tales, says, going blind is like being submerged in water or becoming an animal. They are all representative of going into the unconscious. So again, tying back to that metaphoric death, this is the same concept. To be able to actually transform, we have to go into the underworld, the unconscious, see things from a different perspective. And that is often how blindness is used in Star Wars, as a metaphorical death transformation.
It's also, if you may forgive me for referencing another franchise for a second, it's something you see with disability in general, and that it's often portrayed as almost a religious experience, right? Like Game of Thrones, for example, even though he's not blinded, Bran is thrown from the tower paralyzed. And literally in the book, the show didn't do this because it didn't have the budget for the first season, but he literally goes to the underworld and experiences an entire subconscious view and gets visions of the future, and where he starts his journey to become the Green Seer, the Seer, right? So he's not blinded, but he still fulfills that archetype. And in House of the Dragon, of course, you got someone like Aemond who loses his left eye. I think it's his left. I think it's his left. No, it's his.
Yeah, I think it's his
right eye. Yeah, it's his. I think it's his left eye. And I don't know which one it is, but and there's the reason he loses it is not necessarily as punishment. Well, it is as punishment for taking the biggest, baddest dragon there is and riding it. And the chilling thing is, of course, there's a whole bunch of political context to that scene, how that increases fighting between the factions and, all that. But the most chilling thing about that scene is how one podcaster pointed this out recently when I was reading about it, that the ironic thing is that Aemon doesn't care about any of that. Like, he doesn't care about the political conflict. He's just mad that people aren't talking about how he just did the most badass thing imaginable and transcended, into the sky with a living almost god. I mean, Vagar is even the last of the old dragons and is named after the old Valyrian gods. And, famously he says, as a kid, he says, it was a fair exchange. I lost an eye, but I gained the dragon. And it's chilling to think about when you think about it that way, because he's basically saying, oh yeah, I lost my soul to get this, and I'll happily make that trade. And of course, you see him later with the sapphire in his eye, and it's intentionally brings to mind the imagery of the White Walkers, because and it makes him. So there are some characters that go through a religious experience, but it's not necessarily a transcending thing. It's more of a descending thing.
Well, it's that death state we talked about, right?
Yeah,
this idea it's used as this metaphor for a death state.
Right.
We see that in mythology across the board, like oftentimes like gods like
Odin
giving up his eye so that he can have more wisdom and power associated with that.
And that's that
there is a sacrifice to be made for power. Right. That's how that's used.
The thing I would argue with Aemon, the reason why that's unique is that if I recall correctly, and I'm not super familiar with Norse mythology as other people are, but if I recall correctly, Odin losing his eye is, for wisdom and power, is seen as a very noble thing to do. Whereas Aemon losing his eye and gaining power for it is seen as a horrifying thing to do, because that's not because there's political background to it, but it's also happily making a deal with the devil, and he becomes arguably the most villainous character in the whole story. So there are ways it can be used for bad too. So yes, it can be a rebirth, and you usually see it with heroic characters, but that's a rare villainous example, I think, and you don't see it very often. I mean, you get some examples of, in Star Wars, yes, there's Kreia, who she's a unique example because she did not lose her eye to trauma. She lost her hand later, I believe, but it's also interesting because she, I should note, is also one of the few characters who does not get a prosthetic because she's too prideful. It reminds you of that one great Dooku line from the Revenge of the Sith novel where he's talking to Palpatine just before their fight with Anakin, and he says, "Oh, I hate that mechanical arm that he has." And Sidious is like, "Then why did you cut off his? Maybe you should have cut off his real arm on Geonosis." And Dooku says, "Oh, please, a gentleman would have learned to fight one-handed, right?" So And Kreia is too prideful to get a prosthetic, so she has to abandon the double-bladed lightsaber that she used to have as a Jedi for single blades. And of course, it's interesting how she compensates. She uses telekinetically controlled lightsabers that she flings at you.
The Force to fling. Yeah, that's part of the final fight. Spoiler alert for KOTOR 2. Yeah, for like a crazy old game.
Actually, that more characters would do that, but no, it's actually pretty rare. I mean, it's not.
It is pretty rare. Yeah,
it's still like a desperation thing. It's a last ditch move to win the fight, but it's not like a be all end all. But now, of course, she loses her sight. It's interesting that she loses her sight not due to trauma, but due to atrophy, right? Because she.
Right, because she doesn't use it.
She doesn't use it. She's been seeing through the Force through so long that she says, "I have no more use for my eyes." Which, and you even ask her about it.
It feels very Odin-like or like Aemon, like that. I lose my sight for power. Idea. We also see that in Dune with the Spice Navigators. The Spice Navigators give up their sight and the outside world to be able to see through basically the universe to be able to fold
and
space.
We have, tying into back to Knights of the Old Republic again, we also have the Mariluka species, the seer in the game. I think her name is like Vizier or something like Vizsla, something like that. And her species is born blind. Like they don't lose their sight due to trauma. They're born without eyes because they see their entire lives through the Force. And they're not a common species, I don't think. I mean, I think the Jedi Academy games had Jarrett, who was an old Inquisitor who had that same thing. Who's by the way, very powerful individual. That's small tangent. That's why I always prefer the original Inquisitors to the new ones, but that's a whole other thing. Yeah, we get characters who I think it's interesting that we do get those characters as well, who don't even lose their eyes; they just don't have them, and they just try to perceive the world differently. And you can ask Kreia in the game about, you can ask her like, "What's wrong with your eyes?" Which is a very judgmental and realistic thing, thing to ask her, and she'd be like, and she's literally like, "What's wrong with you? There's nothing wrong with my eyes. Like, what are you blasting at?" Like. And she just says like, "I just don't need them." That's like, do you need any more explanation? It's somehow both condescending and reaffirming at the same time, which I really like. Because that describes her in a nutshell, don't you think? Like, perfectly describes her.
Yeah, I love her as a character.
She's amazing. I've always said that if they were ever to bring her to live action, I always said that someone like Judi Dench should portray her. Which is also, by the way, now that's
Maggie Smith. Maggie Smith.
Nice. Helen Mirren, I think, would be a great
Helen Mirren.
Gosh, like the trifecta.
By the way, I should note, if we were to do Judi Dench, this would be a little ironic now because she's actually losing her sight in recent years.
Oh, really?
Yeah, she's been having the macular degeneration and has trouble reading scripts these days. So it would be authentic, I guess. But
no, that's fair. Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm here. I'm still hoping. I'm sure hoping we might never get one, but I'm hoping. They brought back Thrawn. They brought back Maul. They can hopefully bring back Kreia and Mara Jade. Those are the two characters I want.
Someday.
I did want to briefly talk about how both the Jedi Arts, Jedi and Sith respond to this in that you need to rely on your feelings, your internalized appreciation of the Force, not your vision. That is something that is called out in both the Jedi and the Sith ways of thinking about things, either your emotions, your strong emotions for the Sith, or just your sense of the Force itself in the Jedi. And there's an entire practice around that for both the Jedi and the Sith, that the idea is that sight is deceptive. What you can see with your eyes is deceptive.
And how, ties into themes of light and dark, and that, too much light can blind you. Things like that.
And that the Jedi seek the darkness to be able to connect with the Force because they can't see everything that's with the light.
Yeah.
They need also the darkness. It's like we're in a meta perspective being told that the split between the Jedi and the Sith is not a great thing from either side.
And, if I may make a joke, this probably won't land well, but like it's for example, if you didn't know, the classic eye patch that pirates used to use was actually, it wasn't because they lost eyes. It was because they needed to see below deck. And so
Mhm.
whenever they were raiding a ship and had to storm the basement and the cellar, they would take off the eye patch so they could see with that one eye in the darkness. And it's a
Mhm.
technique that many like Navy
Oh,
Mhm.
SEALs still use that today, like in
Mhm.
different forms, of course, but with night vision. But um, I
just so that that
Mhm.
yeah,
eye
and like
can
I feel like
see.
that's
Ah,
metaphorically, metaphysically, that's might be what they need. They need to find a way
yeah.
to acknowledge the dark, and be ready for
Yep.
it, when it arrives.
Well, that's the only way that like the Jedi themselves could be whole is to actually understand their own
Yeah,
darkness, which is the
Yeah.
Sith, right? So they can't be separated.
yeah,
They need to find a way towards
yeah,
togetherness, right?
and
In that,
yeah, and
yeah.
it's a difficult thing
And the
said.
Acolyte explored that so
Yeah. Yeah.
interestingly.
And whatever faults I have with it, with the pacing and the characters and things like that, like they really did try to deconstruct that moral binary, which I
Mhm.
would argue that the only other, not even in Legends, I think, have they really gone too far into that. I mean, some of
Mhm.
the, maybe some of the later books like Legacy of the Force, you could argue, but that's still like that's an example of a series that is still very protagonist, like moral protagonist centric. Everything the heroes
Mhm.
do is right.
Mhm.
Right.
But something like I mean, the closest example I can think of in recent years is something like Andor, but even then, that's more of a political
Right. It doesn't get as much
construction, not
into
a
the
metaphysical.
right.
Seriously, well
Right.
about Andor, it is probably probably the least metaphysical fantasy of any Star Wars show, which is interesting.
Less textually. It's all still there in the subtext, but it's not textually as much.
Yeah.
What I mean, though, is more. I have never seen a Star Wars show that has fewer fantasy elements, at least a live action show, than Andor does. And that's not a criticism at all. Like it does what it does beautifully. But it's funny. Like I knew someone who actually watched, a former classmate of mine who watched Andor first, and I think they'd never seen Star Wars before, and they were like, "Oh, like, uh, you're telling me this is a world where space wizards exist?" Like, you watch Andor first, and like, you almost can't believe it. Like, it almost feels foreign. Like, oh yeah, like there are actual like
Yeah. But
Jedi
but
people here.
in so many ways that's how it should feel is
Yeah,
that the space wizards are rare,
Right.
yeah,
right? Like
Mhm.
there's only 2,000 of them and it's a huge
yeah.
Right.
galaxy, right? Or
Or
20,000
whatever.
And
Yeah.
or
let's
whatever.
be fair,
Yeah.
science fiction sucks at scale, right? Which in one sense is, I mean,
Yeah.
in one sense that's understandable, right? Like I think the official sources say like, oh yeah, there's like 1 million clone troopers in the whole Clone Wars, and like, bitch, there are 15 million Americans who fought in World War II alone. Like,
Yeah.
not enough
It's
to occupy a planet. But
Yeah.
again, part of it's just from a perspective, but
mhm.
it's also oh, I don't remember where I was going with this, but
That's
yeah,
okay.
it's just a natural thing you have to do in sci-fi. Like it's hard to do, we don't know what a galactic
And
civilization would look like,
Yeah.
and
so we can't.
I would say like part of Star Wars that is like you have to understand that it's trying to speak in metaphor to be
Yeah,
able to understand what it's trying to
yeah,
Yeah.
say. And so
Yeah.
that's part of it is
yeah.
like, space they travel through hyperspace at the speed of
Yeah.
the light.
Yes.
It's
Exactly.
never going to make
Yeah.
sense.
It's like, wait, how come it was so fast and then it took like a week? Yeah.
There's that whole debate about how much time did Luke spend on Bespin, because we see, Han and Leia without the hyperdrive getting to Cloud City, and
Yeah.
that's like one of those infamous questions that the series has never answered. Like
Because it
It
doesn't
it
matter.
the answer doesn't need to.
it doesn't
Who cares,
matter.
right? It
Yeah, it
doesn't
Exactly.
doesn't
matter.
need to. Yeah, exactly.
I want to go back to this one other thing. I really liked what you said about, the eye patch thing and being able to see in both the
Mhm.
light and the dark, because I actually feel like to a great extent, that's what Star Wars is missing. So
Yeah.
I think it was prior to The Last Jedi, during the lead up to The Last Jedi, there was a popular idea that where they were going with the story was the creation of the gray Jedi, or putting the gray Jedi into canon. And there's a lot of arguments over what gray Jedi even are, but I
I think
think
that
that
was, sorry, I didn't
yeah.
interrupt. I think that was actually how the Duel of the Fates script ended, was
Well,
the
but
original plan,
yeah, but see,
roughly.
that's the thing. I think Duel of the Fates script has a lot of problems, a lot of things
Yes,
that
it
I
does.
don't
It
think
is
are
not
consistent
perfect.
with, yeah, well, and just things I don't think are consistent with the ethos of Star Wars, which bugs
Yeah,
me. But I think the gist is this: is that regardless of, how they treated it or where they went and everything, I think that the end point we've talked before needed to be star peace, right? You have the Star Wars, and we need to end with star peace. And they didn't end with star peace, and that's a problem. And the reason they didn't end with it is because they did not reconcile the light and the dark. And the way that you reconcile the light and the dark is that you have them together. You can access both of them freely. You are not cut off from one or the other. So what I really like actually about the eye patch as a metaphor is that is actually what the Jedi need and what the galaxy needs is that.
In Legends, towards the end, it's ironic. It's a bit weird because you can technically argue, yes, Legends has an endpoint, but it's so isolated because the stories of Luke and Han and Leia were never finished. The last stories were like 40 years after Return of the Jedi, and they're interesting and unique, but then you cut forward 70, 80 years, almost 100 years to the legacy of the Force novels, and that organization has the Imperial Knights, which are they're neutral. They're in the middle. They're not light or gray. Their sole service is service to the new Emperor Rowan Fell, who is, by the way, a distant descendant of the Solos. Long story there, but one thing I really like is that it's not the ending, and I think they did a second comic later, but the ending of that story it makes clear that the Sith will always probably be around. The Sith there are still some Sith somewhere. Like they say, oh, it looks like the Sith's been wiped out again, but they're like, really? Are they really? Like, it's almost like, I don't want to phrase like a horror movie ending where the villain's not dead, but you also get, I would have wished that story had ended more with the Imperial Knights as we see them merging with the Jedi or something like that, because once again, the Jedi are nearly wiped out. You've got the distant, very, very distant descendants of Han and Leia with Cade Skywalker and Anya Solo. And like a story like that, it came close to reaching that point, I think, but not quite. And it gave a peaceful ending to the characters. It gave a fairy tale ending to Cade, which we never got for Ben Solo. Gave a good ending to Anya Solo. It gave a good ending to Marisiah Fell, who's the new Empress, who's also a knight herself. But it didn't end with, partially because it wasn't supposed to, right? It was not supposed to be the final story. It was made just before the EU got thrown in the trash and canceled. But so it is a decent ending, but it's not the ending. It's not the permanent ending. And in one sense, it's hard because because of the way Star Wars is constructed, not just as a franchise and a world building, but with multiple authors and things like that. It is hard to give a franchise like this a definitive end. So I mean, look at this even now. Episode 9 was supposed to be the end, but now we've gone beyond that timeline with the new Rey movie, assuming it ever gets made. So it can be difficult.
Yeah,
but
for sure.
But people have tried, and I think there's more they could have done. And I would hope that is what the new Rey movie is going to focus on, is her reconciling with that. Which I'd be disappointed if they didn't do that.
I guess we'll see.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to do next is actually talk about each of the characters that we've kind of briefly referenced in a little bit more detail into discussing them. So let's start out with first Han Solo and the hibernation sickness and the blindness that he experiences. Then Missy, did you want to talk about
so
that?
I really love this because of the fact that this, as everyone has probably heard me talk about before, I'm a really big fan of any sort of Cupid and Psyche, Beauty and the Beast, all those stories, right? The search for the lost husband. And one of the big features in those stories is the concept of the sleeping prince, right? And so you see this with many of the characters. A lot of times he will be injured or sick, or he has been, kind of like a memory wipe, really. Like he no longer remembers his bride or whatever the case may be. But something happens where he needs to be awakened by his bride. And then that actually, it's usually not immediate. It's not like, oh, she awakened him or resurrected him and now he's fine. There's usually a period of time after he is healed or awakened in which he does not recognize her. He does not see her. And she ends up having to reveal herself to him in some way or prove her identity, usually by putting on like her queenly raiment or whatever the case may be. Some, there's
or in this case,
doing
a bounty hunter,
right, or like,
in this case, a bounty hunter.
Yeah, doing something that only she can do, like that kind of stuff. So that's how, and so that is what happens with Han Solo when Leia awakens him in Return of the Jedi. Is he's there and he was in a mythical death state. She awakens him and then he's, who are you? I can't see, and everything. Yeah. And then she takes off the helmet, which of course, is the revelation of the self. And then he recognizes her and knows her and eventually, of course, regains his sight. And so that is his kind of full resurrection, his complete, awakening is in recognizing his true bride. So I do like how that's handled.
One thing I love about, especially the original 3 films, is how much of, again, not most of the themes we see were, of course, obviously intentional, but once in a while, you will get something, a part of the lore that fits a lot of wonderful themes, but of course, behind the scenes, it's totally accidental, right? Like, of course, the reason why they put Han Solo in Carbonite is because, if I remember correctly, they were not sure if Harrison Ford would sign on for another one.
Yeah.
It's funny how, it is pretty funny how even, that doesn't invalidate it, by the way, but it's also funny how a lot of these interpretations we have can be drawn from whole flukes. Like, there's the famous example of The Graduate, the final scene in The Graduate where they're looking at each other on the bus, like wondering, oh God, what did we just do when they're running away together? And of course you find out behind the scenes, oh yeah, they thought the cameras were off. Like, that wasn't meant to be intentional. They thought they had stopped rolling. Like, so it's funny how, it doesn't invalidate any particular experience because, of course, any, death of the author, any experience is valid. But it's funny how we all draw different things from things that may not have even been intentional sometimes.
But it also reminds you that creating a story like this is iterative and collective.
Yeah.
It is a huge collective effort to create any Star Wars. So it's not just one person's vision. And when fans pin it on one person to say, this was all Rian Johnson's fault, it's a disservice to all of the effort that went into it from an entire organization.
It's a collaboration of ideas. I mean, like I said earlier, Donnie Yen, I think, was the one who approached Gareth Edwards and Tony Gilroy with the idea that Chirrut should be blind.
Yeah.
That was not originally intended, right? So something like that.
That was a good lead-in to talk about Chirrut, in how he connects with the Force. And he is not ever described as a Force user, but maybe Force sensitive.
Things are pretty vague there. One thing that, of course, I'm going to add on to this and say, and bring this in and say, one of the reasons I'm actually a defender of the idea of midichlorians is because I've heard George describe it later. Like he said, I didn't explain it well in the movie. What I was trying to say was that midichlorians don't create the Force. They just determine who can sense it and who can't. Like, it's having like extra neurons or a fourth, there are some people with a fourth cone in their eye that allows them to see 50 million different colors, like extra sensory perception, and I heard that explanation and I was like, oh, that's actually a genius idea, because it explains why the Force is hereditary, because we know it is, because Skywalker's but also it doesn't dilute the Force. It just explains a question of why can some people use it and some can't. And of course, stories have been, like Chirrut, have been pretty flimsy with that. It doesn't really explain how Force sensitive he is. It mentions that he and Baze were part of a different order on Jeddah. And of course, the waters have been muddied. Of course, now we've got in Ahsoka, we got Sabine training to be a Jedi, which not the biggest fan of personally, but that's whole other, right? So there's a question of who can use it and who can't, who can access this. Has never really been given a solid answer, because it kind of depends on what you want.
But the midichlorians, to your point, they're a symbiont, right? And so there is heavy emphasis on that in the Phantom Menace, the idea that it's a symbiotic relationship, and this is really important, and that they rely. So the Force user or the Force sensitive relies upon the midichlorians in order to have that connection with the Force. And so what I actually really like about that, and what I think actually plays really well into this conversation about Chirrut specifically, is that is the type of relationship that he has with Baze. So Bays and Chirrut, they come as a pair, and it actually leans into what's referred to as the social model of disability, which is this idea that your society will support you and therefore, like provide all of the access that you need. And so that is really what Bays does for Chirrut. Like on the one hand, Chirrut can obviously take care of himself. And on the other hand, Bays clearly backs him up, supports him. Sometimes he'll even make fun of him, be like, I took that one out. You would have gotten hit if not for me. So so they have a symbiotic.
You're welcome.
Yeah, exactly. They have a symbiotic relationship. And I really, really love the way that that's portrayed. And I think it is a really wonderful way of personifying what they always describe as the midichlorian relationship. So it's very cool.
And it's also the irony of that, of course, is that Bays has lost faith in the Force. So he would hate that metaphor.
Right. Absolutely.
He would hate that metaphor so much.
So true.
Of course, I feel like I remember at the time, I don't see a lot of this today, but I remember at the time when the film was coming out, there were a couple fans who were asking if they were lovers or not, or if they were a couple.
You can interpret it that way if you want,
You can, but I think it's also besides the point. It doesn't matter if they're lovers or best friends. What matters is that they're in a symbiotic relationship with each other. And
they're a duo.
They're a dyad.
Duo. They're a dyad. Yeah, and they work well together because they balance each other out.
Yeah, right? Exactly.
Which is probably why people were, leaning into that idea, and it's good either way. It doesn't matter, like you said.
More of a question, really. Would you argue that there's a reverse version of that, of the dyad? Maybe not a dyad necessarily, but the relationship between Savage and Mole? Because Savage, a little bit, not entirely. It's a bit more twisted than that, obviously, because Sith. But I'm not going to go off on it.
So this is what I would classify as a dark union.
Okay.
Even though Maul wants to enter into it as a dyad, as a balanced duo where they're both equals because they start out as brothers, he slowly starts to become domination or a dominator over Savage, and it eventually leads to Savage's death.
It does.
Right.
And
so
I like that because it's natural.
So that's really, really important because like in psychology, they talk about this idea, like in Marie-Louise von Franz and a few other sources talk about how oftentimes you enter into a relationship that is off balanced. And so every time we have a Master Sith relationship, even if they try to enter into it to be a balanced Force situation, as long as it is reliant on domination, it will eventually lead to the downfall.
And the reason that's one of the reasons why the Darth Plagueis book works so well is because Plagueis is also unique among Sith Lords because he wants a partnership. He views Palpatine as a businessman. He views Palpatine as an asset. Whereas Palpatine can only perceive him as a threat. And of course, that comes into play at the very end when they're about to assume power. Whereas Palpatine cannot. It's the whole,
But even viewing somebody as a subordinate asset does not mean it's a balanced relationship.
It's not.
And that's how, like, you can never have and this is my argument for why, as long as Chimere and Osha stay on sort of this dominator dark side path, even if they choose it for themselves, it would never end up being a good thing.
Exactly.
It never can.
Like it's never going to be a healthy situation. It doesn't mean that it's not valuable for a period of time, but they would have to find their way out.
It's just a fundamental model that doesn't work.
Because domination never equals safety, growth, or nurturing. Yeah.
It's a hierarchical model that it's interesting because you have Sith Lords, like most Sith Lords, like Bane. Of course, the reason why Bane wiped out his previous generation is because they tried to create equality amongst the Order to prevent infighting, and he literally almost can't comprehend a world of equality. Almost, like, I don't want to get into the political aspects, but it's been said that people, use a political psychology comparison. It's been said that about a third of people have a hierarchical view of the world, and about a third have a exclusively egalitarian view of the world, and everyone else is somewhere in between. It's oversimplifying, but when you look at it when you think about it like that, it really kind of ties into the Sith philosophy, and that they literally, a lot of them, with the odd exception, like Plagueis, Dooku is actually another example in the Revenge of the Sith novel, but um, with the odd exception, most Sith Lords almost can't comprehend the idea of an equal partnership, which is why it's inherently parasitic, even
Yep.
even mutually parasitic. You're codependent in some cases.
Right.
So
Right.
Yeah. Let's talk about that though. Like the dark side, even from, this metaphor of blindness to the truth, they purposefully try to keep their apprentices
blinded.
blind to the
Yeah.
truth, blind to what they need. It's a dominator relationship. And Anakin breaking free of that in Return of the Jedi, like we talked about before, just once, let me see you with my own eyes, is the textual version of that symbol to say, I'm breaking free of this concealment, because being in the dark side, being in the underworld, being in the unconscious, being in the darkness is like you can't actually see with your own eyes.
Yeah.
You can't actually
Yeah.
see
One thing,
out the truth.
if I may add on to Vader, again, it's not blindness specifically, but one thing that's really interesting about Vader is, and this ties into his fighting a little bit, his fighting style, but one thing that a lot of the sources and things like that, and novels and things like that, will really go out of their way to emphasize, like comics and novels set during the Purge years. Or probably the best example is Dark Lord: The Rise of Darth Vader, which was written by James Luceno, who wrote the Plagueis novel. For canon viewers, he also wrote Tarkin and Catalyst, which is the Rogue One prequel, the Urso family. But they really touch upon how Vader, even before he spiritually breaks free from the dark and frees himself, he's already learning how to free himself from the limitations of his suit in some ways. He's learning how to use it, how to turn his suit into a combative advantage. It takes him a couple of years to really get used to it. And of course, it's never comfortable, right? I mean, it's mentioned he can't really eat or sleep, right? But how he uses that to his leverage, and went back even further by the Force. He's a more devastating threat. Like he undergoes almost, I don't want to quite say a rehabilitation, but an adaptation, which is a small thing I will say. One of the things that disappointed me on Maul a little bit is that they didn't focus more on that. And that partially due to the story structure of Clone Wars. It's 3-episode arc structure, which I'm not a huge fan of. It's one of the reasons I'm not as big as on Clone Wars as other people are. But with Maul, using Maul, use a comparison, in Legends, we also have Lumaya, who was the original acolyte, who was Darth Vader's acolyte. She was a rival to Mara Jade. Like Maul, she lost everything in a botched mission. Had to get a bunch of cybernetic implants. I don't think it was specifically said what kind of implants, but major implants. And she, in the early Marvel comics, she was just as unhinged as Maul was during a lot of the Clone Wars material, and just purely set on revenge. And that failed, and she eventually did rehabilitate herself, but it took years, like 20, 30, 40 years, for her to not just accept herself, but also reinvent herself. And again, mostly it's a story qualm that I wish with Maul. If Clone Wars had been structured with the same kind of story arc as like the Bad Batch or Rebels, with a more longer arc kind of thing, if you know what I'm talking about, I think we could have seen. I wish we could have seen a lot more of that from Maul. So watching him come to terms with his cybernetic legs.
Yeah.
Watching him trying to rehabilitate himself, and of course, eventually rebrand himself. But that's
Yeah. I think it's because they want Maul to be trapped in this cycle that he can't escape from. And if he were to really integrate, the new legs as a symbol of like his new self and who he is now, and integrate what happened to him and accept what happened to him,
then he
wouldn't be Maul.
Because he is Sisyphus,
right? Exactly.
As Freddie has talked about,
right?
And
but again, though, I feel like they could have explored that a bit more. Like maybe we watch him try to cope with it, and whether it's insecurity.
We always want dark side, like, because darksiders represent the darkness in ourselves, and we want to see them come to terms with like their own darkness and find a healthier way to exist.
Yeah.
So seeing Ventress sort of recover from the dark side in the way that she has in rejecting its principles and then making her way slowly back to a balanced version of herself. Now that we have seen in the Bad Batch has been so satisfying because we've actually seen it.
Even though I never watched a lot of the Bad Batch. I need to give it another shot. I tried it twice. I never got a chance to finish it. But when I was so happy when I heard Ventress was back, because I don't know about you two, if you either have read it. I read Dark Disciple when it came out, and I was like, wow, I actually kind of hate this book. Like, I don't hate it. That's a strong word, but partially because it's essentially remapping old Clone Wars comics and with entire scenes ripped from it. But
no, it was a combination of taking Clone Wars scripts.
It was.
The Clone Wars comics that were associated with it, right?
Was.
So they were written originally by Katie Lucas, and then it was remapped to basically be the plot of a story. And I like it, except for Ventress's end, because it is probably one of the hardest decisions I've ever seen. And so seeing her come back in the Bad Batch, and knowing that she survived that, and it doesn't matter how she survived that, because it was all a metaphorical death, as we've been talking about to begin with. With this, we've had an opportunity to talk about all of the different aspects of blindness as a disability, as visual impairment within Star Wars, and also from a lens of a mythic and folklore motif perspective. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a great conversation to offer your insight into this. Missy, of course, thank you for all of your knowledge and reading into the folklore and the fairy tales surrounding these motifs and everything like that. Ryan, where can people find you if they're looking for more of your thoughts online?
Oh gosh. I'm on Twitter, just at RyanLooney8. You can also search my name on Collider. If you're interested in more of my writings, I've written about Star Wars. I wrote about The Boys and House of the Dragon, especially recently. So,
thank you so much for joining us, Missy. Where can people find you?
I am on Tumblr at All Girls Are Princesses.
Thank you, everyone, and cheers. Thank you for listening to What the Force. I'm Marie-Claire Gould, your host. Our music is orchestral music by Christy Carew for What the Force. You can support the show directly on Patreon at patreon.com/whattheforce. We would like to thank all our patrons, especially those who love What the Force: Sophie H., Scott, Derek C., Minky Moo, Sarah Joy, John, In Wild Space, How Rude, Anna Perez, Neil, Christian Luca, Carly Ann, Scott C., and Susan. Support the show by wearing the Force with our merch, like and subscribe on YouTube, or leave a 5-star review on iTunes or any other pod app. It helps people find the show. You can connect with us on Twitter at WT Force Show, What the Force Podcast on Facebook. Our website is whattheforce.ca, or the Discord. Links are in the liner notes. Feel free to reach out and start a conversation. Cheers.